Really, with the focus of today's discussions, we're going to talk about how to break away from what I call these monolithic deployments. It's one of the core features of DeployHub. So just to level set how DeployHub really fits in, DeployHub fits underneath the continuous delivery process. If you think about what the primary goal of continuous delivery is to produce these short cycles of software development and making sure that this software can be released at any time and hopefully released frequently. It doesn't itself do compiling code, it doesn't actually do testing, and it doesn't do deployment. It does all the higher level orchestration that pulls all of this together to push things quickly across your pipeline. And when we do that, we sort of have this full package dev, test, prod process. It's kind of waterfall-y, to be quite honest. And in most practices, what's occurring is your software is compiled as a packaged, so it's pushed across the pipeline as a packaged, and it's released as a package. So while you may be trying to do some kind of agile process where you make one change and then you push that change across, you're doing iterative software updates, but you're not doing iterative compiles and iterative releases, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So if you think about how that looks from a monolithic point of view, your dev, test, and prod package gets moved across your CD pipeline. Your workflow itself is built around a release. So you have a application, you have your repository for everything, and you have a release for everything. And when you do the deployment, you might go out to physical servers, clouds, or Docker containers, but in essence, it's monolithic. It's a full release. And there's different methodologies. Some implementations have a workflow as defined for every full release, but a point release is just an update. So it's a matter of how many workflows you're managing. We got this kind of figured out, and I'm going to now shift some gears just so you guys have something to think about. And we're going to talk about Kubernetes and microservices and how that changes. Because even though you may be an Agile developer and you're not doing this yet, the shift to microservices is an iterative shift. It is moving away from monolithic deployments. And with a microservice, there's some basic functions that, or there's some basic description of what a microservice should look like. I like to say think functions. A microservice is really an implementation of a small set of strongly related functions. They're services that change together and are packaged together, but they're not the entire application. A containerization isn't just taking your application and moving it into a Docker container. It's decomposing it and organizing it so it can fit some of these descriptions of what a microservice is. And one of this is the service can be changed without affecting other clients. You know, we may get there. I think that's somewhat, it's possible to do, but we're probably going to have situations where there's backward compatibility issues and dependency issues. So there's three main challenges of microservices that breaking away from monolithic deployments kind of create. And that is, first is you shift from having that single workflow to multiple workflows. So every microservice is going to probably have its own repository, and it's going to have its own CircleCI workflow. You also have a challenge of mapping the microservices back to your monolithic equivalent. And you know, I've been asked, why do you need to do that? And we're going to talk a little bit about why you might need to do that. The other thing is figuring out how to share and catalog your microservices. And then fourth, if you're not doing microservices yet, but you still want to start doing things in an iterative way that's going to represent what it's going to look like when you do monolithic, you have to start thinking in terms of how to do an iterative deployment in your Agile cadence. So let's just talk about the first one. Something to think about here is, because microservices are going to be independently deployable, when you start rolling them out, are they going to have their own repository and their own workflow? When I ask this question, most people say yes. So what that's going to look like is each of your microservices is going to have its own process, and it's probably going to have its own dev, test, prod, waterfall. And I think one of the things you should start thinking about as you think about microservices and Kubernetes and this modern architecture, which is many reasons to go to it, is how many workflows might you have? That will make a difference, and it's just a discussion that you should start having. Now with DeployHub, one of the benefits of DeployHub is you can have as many workflows and as many repositories as you need, and we aggregate that back down to the monolithic equivalent, which is our second challenge, is how do you map and version your logical view of your application? Once you've decomposed it, you still need a logical view of what it looks like. And there are many reasons for it. Number one, you have to pass that information over to service mesh. Number two, if you're a publisher of a microservice, you want to know who's consuming them, because if there's a problem with it and you want to update that microservice, how do you deprecate the old one and let everybody else know who's using it? So you have to have an idea of what the applications are that's consuming it. There's other reasons too, which get into monitoring and performance monitoring, but we're not going to get into in this discussion. But again, it's something to think about. So mapping the microservices to the applications that consume them will be important. And again, as you see how things would move across, you know, your CI/CD process is going to have these microservices coming through these workflows, and DeployHub is going to give you that application version information. Now, microservices have what I call a million little pieces to them. If you think of Lambda specifications, your Helm chart installation logic, or if you're using Ansible Galaxy roles or Red Hat operators, because we're moving to an architecture that has little itty bitty servers, which are called containers that your microservice is running in, each one of those have a configuration that defines how they talk to the Kubernetes layer, whether it be setting a timeout or setting how your memory is used. Every single one of them has to have that configuration. If a configuration of a microservice changes, guess what? You have a new version of your microservice, which means you have a new version of your application. And with DeployHub, we do what we call configuration mapping, so that you can track those changes and you can version it. So if you think about, you know, taking the monolithic view to a logical view, with your Kubernetes pipeline, what we'll call it, if you're using Kubernetes and you have all these microservices running through all these workflows coming from all these different repositories, what DeployHub does for you is sits on top of that and says, I'm going to aggregate this all together and I'm going to track it. Now, something else to think about is this thing called service mesh. Istio just got funded, $12.5 million got invested in Istio, which means that we've finally arrived. So service mesh is going to change. Right now, you can think of service mesh as a request router. It also kind of does your linking and says, and sort of defines where to kick off your application, let's just say, and who's using it. In the future, what's going to occur is service mesh is going to do even more advanced request routing. So instead of having a dev, test, and prod environment, you're not going to have that waterfall anymore. We're finally going to blow up the waterfall. And what you're going to have is service mesh routing personas to different versions of the microservices that need to be used. Think of this as feature flag management. So when you have an application that is got version 1 of all of these different microservices, and then you have now a version 2, you may have service mesh may reroute the dev team to run the application with version 2. But prod and test are still at version 1 of everything. And as you can imagine, this will change on a high frequency basis, and we'll have a lot of moving parts together. But it will only be deployed once. So what's going to be critical in your deployment thinking is the configuration of what you've deployed and how it's interacting with service mesh in the future. It's actually going to be a very exciting time. I've looked forward for this for a long time, and I'm so happy that Kubernetes is bringing this to us. But just like in the object-oriented programming world, when we had all this reuse, we needed a way to catalog and publish it. Now, just the way CircleCI creates a catalog of the orbs that they have so you can find them and pull them down and reuse them, DeployHub does that for microservices. So it catalogs and publishes and shares the microservices across your team. And to learn, really what you want to think about is what I like to call this the microservice soup and the hairball that it creates when you start deploying microservices, but you don't know how they're connected. There's an effort of collaboration that's required for microservices. And let's say you have a team on the 8th floor that's doing security and they have a great logon routine, and the 4th floor doesn't know about it, they're going to go write their own. So there's something called domain-driven design that is an area of a way to manage microservices and to catalog them. Many companies right now are trying to do this in Excel spreadsheets. DeployHub does it, provides you a platform to do that. Now, just a point of clarification, when we say that we are a catalog for these microservices, we don't require that you store your microservices with us. Your container can be put in any kind of container like Docker Hub or Quay or Red Hat. We just provide a pointer to where it's being pulled from. So we provide a pointer from where it's being pulled from and all the configuration details with it, and we organize it for you so somebody else can find it. And then also DeployHub does what we call iterative deployments, even for for a typical kind of legacy monolithic style release process. Because it has the ability to version things on the back end, it can improve the way you do deployments. Now I know that you all are already doing deployments and you have a script that you probably are running to do that. And we hear this a lot, you know, I've got one that's quite nice. But there are reasons why you want to move away from the monolithic. If you really want to start managing an agile heartbeat where you're only updating the changes and you're not updating everything every time, and this habit will be something you want to learn now because it's going to apply to microservices. So part of the reason why we can do this for you is because we break the application out into its pieces. We can do database updates, we can update the infrastructure, environment variables, as well as the application components. So if you have an update that changes your jar file and has a SQL change as well, we can manage those two pieces. If you just want to update your environment variable, we can just manage the environment variable change. And we do this because we have a back-end version control engine that tracks all of these configurations that allows you to jump forward. Literally, you can jump from version 2 to version 5, and we will only apply the differences. We don't have to reapply everything. Now, it has a rollback feature too, so if you want to roll it back, we keep track of the differences in what needs to roll back. Now, if you're rolling back a jar file, you just reapply the previous jar file. But if you want to roll back a database, and you have to do that, it provides you that rollback feature for the database, and it can roll it back incrementally. So DeployHub supports both iterative and microservice deployments, so you can use it for your agile practices and as you move into microservices. It's based on a project called Ortelius. Ortelius was Abraham Ortelius created the first atlas. And the Ortelius project is really focused on the microservice configuration mapping and sharing and versioning. And it's hosted on GitHub, and we'd love for contributors to join. This is a new project, and we are looking for stars and contributors. DeployHub team is based on Ortelius, and it's a free SaaS offering, which means that everything that you're doing right now with CircleCI can be enhanced for free. You simply use the CircleCI Orb to connect up to the SaaS environment for managing your deployments, and you can start today learning how to do iterative deployments, improve your deployment process, have full auditability of it, and start learning how to deploy microservices. The upgrade's fairly inexpensive. It ends up being $2,500 a year per application team, so it's about $200 a month to use it. If you want to do the Pro, and the Pro has features around security that many production teams may require. What DeployHub does at a high level, first it allows you to catalog and use a domain-driven design to organize any reusable component, microservice or otherwise. So it becomes a central area for publishing. So once you figure out how you want to define your catalog, then you can start publishing to the catalog. Once you've published to the catalog, you can create an application map and drag and drop the components that you want into that application map. And on the back end, DeployHub starts doing that versioning and starts understanding how many applications are consuming which microservices or which reusable components. And then after it does that, you can do those fast and safe deployments, whether it be microservice or your legacy. So downloading, installing, you can get you can sign up for DeployHub at from DeployHub.com. You sign up, and what occurs is you are sent an email. We use you define what your domain, your high-level domain you want to be, and to allow you to start publishing your reusable components and building your application map. You can download the CircleCI Orb. And then once you do those two things, you probably already have CircleCI configured. Once you configure DeployHub, you can update your config file with the integration points. So Angel talked about what your configuration file looks like. You add into your configuration file the steps that you want DeployHub to do. This one's using an approve job, a move job, and a deploy job. In reality, the deploy job is the one that's most critical and the one that you would need to add. So the approve job does allow a process for approvals so that you can actually include an approval process before you promote something up the pipeline. And that approval occurs as the user ID is passed from CircleCI to DeployHub. And then depending on your DeployHub configuration, you may need to call the approve job. So not everybody has to use that. And then there's the move job. A move doesn't actually do a deployment. It just says this is in dev, or this is in test, or this is in some version, some state of your pipeline. So it hasn't quite, it's approved it, it's moved it into the state, and then you do the deploy. And the deploy actually does the release. Now, DeployHub does not require any agents, so you don't have to have any in-target agents in one of your containers or in a cloud image. It does it with standard protocols, and it will execute whatever the activities are that says how to install something. So let's say you're using a Helm chart to do the install, it would execute that Helm chart for you. Let's say you have a homegrown script in the back end that does the install logic, it would do that as well. So every one of your components has an activity associated to it, and when it does the deployment, it executes those activities, and that activity could be updating, running a SQL statement or updating an environment variable. When you do download it, CircleCI, it would be installed in your local environment. It could be installed in a hosted environment as well. You could have it on a cloud if that's where you have it installed, but it's going to be on your side of the firewall. When you sign up for DeployHub Team, you get a reverse proxy that is secure, so it only does a one-way knock. So your proxy is knocking up to the DeployHub UI and where the database is stored with all your metadata. And again, remember that your actual components are still stored in a repository like GitHub or Quay, and we only provide a pointer to that. And I'm going to leave it at that. You can follow me on Twitter. I talk a lot about Kubernetes, and I'm very excited about building out these K8 pipelines. Sign up for free and check out my blogs as I sing the songs of Kubernetes and microservice. And on that, I think we can open it for questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy. That was an awesome presentation. I actually learned a little bit. I remember the days of deploying in the 90s, and we've come a long way.
We have. We've come a very long way. We're going to have to come a little farther, though, to start doing microservices as well.
Yeah, sure. Right, baby steps. So I don't see any questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to, put them into the Q&A. Just click the Q&A button there and just submit your questions there. I have a question for you, Tracy. So how would one go about integrating things like provisioning tools, like let's say maybe HashiCorp's Terraform or Pulumi, which is a new kid on the block?
Yeah, so those would be, we'd actually call that a component, believe it or not.
Okay.
And a component would have an activity associated to it, and we would call that. So let's talk about that for a minute. So these are like workflow activities in what I call the workflow with the little w, not the big W. What CircleCI is doing is workflow at the big W, where we are saying, you know, check out the code, compile, push it. If this workflow is great, push it across and have the test workflow execute. Those are the big W orchestrations. When we're talking about the lower level, obviously there is a workflow logic that's associated to doing a deployment, but they're at a much lower level, right? So at that lower level, we would be creating a component, and something like what you just described would be a component, and there would be an activity associated to it that would call out to another tool that might do that provisioning. In the same way that we might, you know, we haven't seen it yet, but I suspect we'll start seeing tools call things like Rancher as part of maybe to check a part of the environment configuration. But again, they're going to be down at the low level W, the lower level W than the higher level W, because it's something that's done at deployment time.
I think we have a question here, Tracy. So the question is, you mentioned the service mesh. Is this HashiCorp console that you are referring to, or does DeployHub maintain its own mesh?
DeployHub does not maintain its own mesh. Right now, we are integrated with Istio. We're looking at doing some integrations to Linkerd as well, since it's part of the CNCF. So we rely on service mesh for quite a few things. And we will start relying on it even more in the future. Right now, you can do deployments without service mesh, but we do not support, we don't have our own service mesh. We're just going to integrate with who's going to be the winner. And it's probably going to be Linkerd or Istio.
Yeah, Istio is pretty hot right now, right? Been seeing them quite a bit. So are there any other questions from the audience? I'm sure there's something brewing around.
And I want to just, since we're waiting here, I want to,
Sure.
I'm going to get on another soapbox. So continuous delivery should always have an automation underneath it. Moving away from scripts is going to be pretty critical as you do microservices, in my opinion. I don't think you're going to be able to manage as much as you think you can in Excel spreadsheets and scripts. The reason why more teams don't do automated deployments using automation instead of using scripts for their deployments is because of the cost. It's not because they don't want to. Our competitors, if you just look at doing iterative deployments, our competitors are very expensive. Xavia, Electric Cloud, IBM, CA, they're charging a lot of money for this. And what happens is it congests the process, because instead of a development team saying, hey, I want to automate this, I'm going to use something that I can get my hands on and I'm going to automate it, and it's going to create some visibility for the operations team, so they're going to embrace it. The operation teams go through this 8-month cycle of trying to figure out what tool that they should use to rule everybody, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. That model of selling is so old-fashioned. It's so not agile. And what ends up happening is, while they're trying to figure out what single deployment tool is going to be used for the entire organization, the smart guys on the development side go ahead and write their scripts to do it, and they have some really unsung hero who's continuing to support those scripts. That unsung hero needs to do something else, because having a real smart person do that forever is a waste of a resource, and they could start decomposing applications and building out microservices. So that when we created DeployHub and we created Ortelius and we offered the free version, that's what I was thinking. It's like, how do we get this? How do we get automation tools in the hands of developers without having to go through an 8-month sales POC and do a shooting match between 4 vendors and have 15 or 20 people on a committee to make the decision? It doesn't work.
Yeah. So I have I guess a question for you, Tracy, regarding what you just said. So and we're, in regards to scripts, right? You had mentioned scripts that folks have running. Now, obviously, right, there's different kinds of scripts. Like when I used to write deployment scripts, I guess they would be considered more orchestration type scripts, right? So like scripts don't completely go away; they just get smaller, right?
They get much
to do more specific things.
Exactly. They do much more. They're much more like a microservice, right? Like a microservice has a activity associated to it, and there may be you call a Helm chart to do that.
Right. I just wanted to kind of get you to distinguish between the two, because when you first said scripts, I was like, whoa. But
I'm talking about the big deployment scripts that you've probably struggled and had to support. And the person who writes that is kind of screwed, because they want to do a deployment on Friday and they get all their stuff checked in on Friday night and they want it done by Monday. Guess who works on the weekend?
Yeah. Well, that's what ops teams are for, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Just kidding. No, well, I don't see any more questions. Doesn't look like audience have any questions. So I'm going to give you guys one more chance. If you have any questions for Tracy or myself about Circle, about deployments, about DeployHub, fire away, please. Going once, going twice. I guess not, Tracy.
No problem. Well, thank you, Angel. This has been great. I've enjoyed it.
Same here. Really interesting presentation. And again, you brought back some memories.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But like I said, I'm excited to see what the future holds for, continuous delivery and deployment for sure.
It will look different. We have to do some work together, I'm sure.
Wait a minute. We got a question. Here we go. How exactly do CircleCI and DeployHub work together? I can answer some of that, and Tracy, if you want to.
No, go for it.
Pick up where I leave off.
Yeah.
Well, so basically CircleCI, like I mentioned earlier, CircleCI has this concept of orbs, which are shareable configurations, right? Reusable shareable configurations. And when we decided to, release this feature, we did realize that, hey, there are people using other companies' products within their CI/CD pipelines. So when we identified that, we decided to reach out to partners, the folks which equal to the folks that were the owners of the products that were being used by our CircleCI users. And we told them about our Orbs project or feature, and they jumped at the opportunity to help us or help us integrate their products into the Orb ecosystem. And the way they do that is basically the partners come up with they develop their own Orbs and they maintain their own Orbs, and then we certify them as partners at CircleCI. So that, basically we have an agreement that says, hey, your DeployHub or your whoever else partner, you could go ahead and develop this Orb. We'll certify you as a partner and then host it on our repository. So it's like a catalog of all the Orbs that are out there. And this includes Orbs that are just certified by CircleCI folks. So usually if CircleCI, the company itself, our developers develop an Orb, if we put it through our certification process and it gets certified. If a partner develops an Orb, we also put it through a certification process and then certify it, but it's a partner certification. And I'll turn over to Tracy if she wants to add, if you want to add some more to that, Tracy.
I think it's important to clarify. Oftentimes, tools like CircleCI, they do a really great job of orchestrating to the point that there's a perception that CircleCI is running the compile and link process, CircleCI is executing tests, and CircleCI is doing application release automation. which is automated deployments. And when in reality, they're orchestrating that. And in many cases on the build and the release side, a script is used, and CircleCI calls that script and does the centralized logging so you can see what occurred. So the way DeployHub works with CircleCI is to automate what you would normally call underneath when you build your workflow and you exit out to do the deployment. What's doing that deployment? Are you calling a script probably to do the heavy lifting? DeployHub gets put in that place. And the reason why you use the automation tools underneath it is for the visibility that we talked about, for the ability to do things in an iterative way, to be able to track what they often call like a value chain, to be able to see if a particular when a workflow executed it and how long it took for that code to get all the way out to an end user, and just to stop scripting this stuff. It's you know, you can script and go a long way with scripts, but it's not automation. You've got to have somebody who understands those scripts. The goal of automation is to bring it up a level and not have that that manual process. And a script, no matter how you slice it, is kind of manual. Somebody's managing it, and every time there's a new version, you got to tweak it. So it's kind of moving away from that. And as you move away from that, you're better prepared to do microservices.
Yeah, I just to share a little experience from before I joined CircleCI, I worked at a small startup in Philadelphia, and I was, I guess, in the startup, right? I wore many hats, and one of them was the chief, I guess, DevOps was the position title. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, I remember we had a monolith application, and it was all Scala, Java based. With 3 different persistence layers, which were like Redis, and we had MongoDB, and then also was it MySQL on the back end, right? And when we decided to decompose this monolith, I was charged with orchestrating all the updates. So it took us about a year to decompose it. But at the end of the day, I was in script hell for the most part, for the better part of like 2.5 years, until I was able to leverage all these new technologies, such as, Docker containers. And at the time, I think I was using Amazon's ECS service, right? Because Kubernetes wasn't fully baked at the time.
Thank goodness it is now.
Well, right. It's from what I understand, I haven't gotten back to this Kubernetes, but it's a lot better than when it was when I was working with it. But at the end of the day, yeah, I was super impressed with how configuration was one of the biggest problems to solve. And I was impressed because it's a hard problem to solve, and I don't think anyone really. There's a lot of ideas out there, but I don't think anyone has a very clear way to get you there and manage those configurations.
And that's really what our focus is how do we and we'll continue to improve on the process as we learn this new architecture.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think we'll just call it a day.
Okay.
I want to thank everyone for attending and listening to us today. And yeah, Tracy, thank you for giving us this awesome presentation. And hopefully we'll have some more.
Yes.
In the future.
And everybody starts, it's again, I always say it's better to have a dialogue than a monologue. And so start having this dialogue about what this is going to look like within your organizations, because it is going to change quite a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, so everyone go check out Tracy's or DeployHub's open source project.